right. Could it be working? Could it possibly be working the very first time? Great Scott. All right. Looks like it is about 11 o'clock, and I think I'm about ready to start. And that is assuming my video is working. All right, let's see if this is working. If you happen to, I think everything's working. The one thing that I am not entirely sure of is well, the one thing that I'm not entirely sure of is audio, but I think I'm getting some bouncing levels that I am for audio. Let us hope that is as. All right, welcome to live critique. And of course, right when I start, there's a siren going off in the background, which that's living in LA. Enjoy me at 11 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time. I'm doing this every on Thursday at 11 a.m. in Los Angeles time, whatever that is, PST or PDT, whatever the case may be. If you want to, if you want to be part of this critique, work that you are either working on or that you've done completed recently, that you'd just like feedback on, you can send me images at dabbleon@gmail.com. That's ABBLEON at gmail.com. And I will address. So that you're curious about whether it's working or not working, or can't quite figure out what's not working, include that in your email or have a go at it, and I will. And a pretty gentle critiquer. So I hope you don't feel intimidated or embarrassed to have me talk about your work. I really do think it is beneficial for all of us to hear and to talk about artwork and to kind of pick it apart and what's working, what's not working. In these times when we are kind of isolated, we're by ourselves in the studio, have as much access to you and other people to tell work. Is a very important part of what we do as artists and communicators. You can find more information about other things that I am currently working on or offering at dabbleon, DABON.com. I do have an ongoing class at the moment, Resin Techniques, which will be ending this coming week, and it's been going fantastically well. I hope to very shortly be publishing my color class, which will be available dabble on, as well as updating some of my other offerings. It's just, as usual, busier than ever, and I've always got more plans than I have time. So keep an eye out on dabbleon.com. Also, if you would like to be informed of any new offerings or new um, opportunities at Dabbleon, make sure you sign up for my email list, which is also available at dabbleon.com. Up at the top of the page, there should be a button where you can click and enter your email address so you get any updates. And then, of course, I'll also be updating here on Facebook and elsewhere. So if you watch this, you'll probably hear announcements as they come out too. So today, today I am going to be digging into a topic that I've been thinking a lot about lately. Um, I think it's the personality. I don't know if it's a feature or a bug. I don't know if it's is beneficial. Whatever the case may be, I to question my questions constantly. And one of the questioning, as in the past week, just been thinking about focal point. Focal point. So focal point is where our eye is primarily attracted to. Focal point. That's you can have more than one focal point where your eye tends to get towards, or what grabs your immediately when you look at an image. Primary focal point, a secondary focal point, a tertiary focal point, and not. And of course, point. That's kind of what I talk about is what are the situations might be okay not to have a focal point, and why do we need to have a focal point? What's so important about focal point anyway? And of course, there are so many different kinds, so many different contexts displayed in, so many ways that we use art to communicate, that there's no hard and fast rule about it. And different things are going to be relevant in different situations. So what I would like to go through, I found a bunch of images on Instagram. I do not have these images. They're the artist's name, because I don't know if they want me to be their names as I talk about this, but they're publicly available on Instagram. So I feel like there is, this is fair use. This is educational. Let's take a look at some of these images that I searched for the hashtag and came up with a bunch of images. Screenshotted some of them. Look at them through this lens of focal point. So looking at this image, and of course I forgot to get rid of this guy down there. Looking at this image, I'm going to get rid of this. Create a focal point, and that's kind of what I want to be talking about. So let me edit down to fill, and we're going to do content aware fill and get rid of that. Good enough. Okay. And that right there. All right, so let's take a look at this image. Pretty straightforward painting. Looks like we got rule of thirds, divisions vertically, and then we've got a fairly strong division down the center. We've got a lot of stuff. Grab a color. We got a lot of really aggressive marks and high contrast here in the center. We've got these vertical lines that are gouged, so there's kind of a material texture about them, and then black and white contrast. We have this really saturated red spot, and the of the painting is where these kind of cool shades of gray, so that red to stick out as kind of anomalous, and it's right in the middle. So this is probably where our eye is going to go to. And then over here, where there's another kind of anomalous mark here where it looks like there's a concentration of small little scrapey marks. Again, high value contrast and saturation, red next to neutral in the background. It's a busy shape next to a fairly, or in front of a fairly calm or flat background. And then I'm go over here where I've got another circle, or kind of this ellipse, vertical ellipse that kind of ties into that. And it is a fairly aggressive mark. It's ground. 1, 2, 3. Right? Kind of primary, secondary, tertiary. Let's go to this one. So in this case, we've got an obvious subject matter. We've got these girls in the field. It's obvious to me which girl I should be looking at. We tend to gravitate towards faces, specifically to eyes. We can see these eyes a little bit better. She's sitting up, so maybe there's a psychological attraction to that, like she's at attention. He's looking at something, so maybe, again, psychologically, we're thinking, well, what is she looking at? This girl is laying down. She's got high contrast. It's a big dark shape and a fairly warm shape next to this grass. So there's high value contrast there. This shape, this has red clothes on, and that red and green are complements, and it's a fairly saturated red. Her head is right in the center. So that might be pulling our attention more. This hat is very high contrast. It's closer to us in space, or the implication is that it's closer to us. At the bottom of the picture, the z-axis, or implied in this case, the illusion of a z-axis, closer to where we stand as the observer. But really, you get this light hitting the side of this girl's face, and you got to have some compositional lines that kind of guide us into the distance, and then you got this dark spot, back in the distance. So there are some, it's obvious the way that these girls are sitting here in the foreground, or kind of, I guess, midground, foreground, high contrast, occupying a lot of the picture, and then them being the only people in the picture. So there's a lot of things that guide us to lock in on these two girls and maybe the relationship. But there is no, in my view, very obvious focal point, once we get to them, to the two of them. So maybe there's this issue of how specific a focal point is. Like, does it need to be locking in on a person's nose or their eyes, or can a focal point encompass a larger area of the overall image? In this case, we have this guy. Obviously, focal point is him. Lots of text, lots of color contrast between him and the background. A fairly neutral green background and saturated red in his clothes. But his face is kind of evenly treated. There's not a whole lot of value contrast there. The paint application is all fairly evenly treated. The brushstroke size, and you kind of a lot of the detail in here because it's kind of lumpy. There's not, it's not a very clear light source. In fact, let me take the color information out of there. So we're just looking at black and white. And there's just a little suggestion of a light source in from the top right, the viewer's right. And there's kind of a secondary light source, maybe an ambient light source hitting this side of the face, because we've got this core shadow that's happening on the bridge of his nose and under his nose, which tells me he's got a primary light source coming in from one side and an ambient light source coming in from the other side. But really, it's very lumpy. So I'm not especially drawn to his eyes. There's not really high contrast there like there usually is. There's no specular highlight where we have that little point. Anyway, I feel myself wanting to focus here on his face, but because it's so kind of mushy in there, I have a hard time locking in. In that last one, let me go back there. In this last one, I feel like there's a focal point that is intended. Like I'm supposed to be looking here on his face, but I've got a lot of competing visual information rest of the image that for my attention kind of pulls me away, and I feel like emotionally disconnecting, right? Which is a bad thing. And so here's where I get the important. In this case, I mean, I guess I could this peacock in the foreground. It occupies maybe a larger area of the composition than any other foreground here with its tail feathers. But to value one of the rest of these birds and how they're dark black. Peacock in kind of a of gray. Or these other birds are higher contrast, but still I feel the size of this bird it is, and blue next to these kind of red in the background that make it stand out. There's a lot of this going on. All the birds are fairly size or scale. So and they're all kind of spaced. So I look at this and I'm really told to look at a particular space. And this was the image that kind of got me thinking along these lines. So do I have a focal point here? Is a focal point necessary? What does a focal point do? Why might it be necessary, or what might its significance be? So in this, I think I look at this image and feel more decorative. I think birds, trees, the even spacing or shape of all the negative space, reds, red oranges. When there is no focal travel, the whole place, and I think I say it doesn't really feel particular. It's not trying to tell us today. It's just kind of displaying this information to observe as if looking around, not necessarily focus color, texture, right? So that kind of gets into of this painting. To is it meant to communicate a story? And this is so. Any other pictures here? Let's look at a couple more before I get into what I was going to say next. So in this case, we have flowers. Flowers are the focal point, but just little girls in the other painting. I don't necessarily get the like. I guess this flower up here at the top is the biggest flower forward, so we see this that kind of draws us in. It's fairly high contrast. It's isolated from other flowers, maybe more so down here at the bottom. So maybe this is the focal point, but this flower is also high contrast and has maybe more interesting petals, the way that they're shortened. And this flower is kind of equally isolated over here. So I don't know. I don't really feel like there is a super strong focal point here either. If you anything, at least anything more specific than just the whole grouping of flowers. And then in this case, the flower vase. See, look at these stripes on the flower vase and the colors of the stripes. It looks kind of a pearlescent or highly reflective vase here. Spacing of those stripes, and the way they curve are reflected in the plant itself, and then all these lines and shapes around. So everything is kind of equally treated. There is, contrast there. Nothing that really sticks out dramatically. It's all kind of the same stuff. There's flow, there's movement, there's interesting textures and shapes and patterns, but I don't feel myself being drawn anywhere specific. Maybe if I had to choose one place, it would be the vase down here at the bottom, because it's a big dot, it's a big circle, high contrast, and kind of a larger shape than most of the other shapes in this plant, and it sits in the foreground, other things like that. But really, I don't find a really strong focal point there. In this case, focal point, where does my eye go? There's so much texture here. This figure is closest to us, but it gets kind of lost in all this information of these other two figures, right? Especially if I take the color out and we just look at it in terms of value. This figure in the foreground gets lost in all this, the jumble of information. So I would say this figure off to the right, my right, because it's kind of isolated and it has a little bit more space to breathe around, it doesn't get lost in all this information, perhaps is more of a focal point. It has this leaf right above the head. The figure's face is resolved, or at least more easy to see. This face is mush. This face is fairly mush. And this face is kind of hard to see any definition there. So this is just by its level of resolution, its legibility, and also its isolation is more of a focal point. Here, this top face up at the top, because it's the biggest, it occupies a lot of space relative to the other faces. It's at the top, and all of these lines on both sides of the contour, overall positive shape, kind of point us in that direction. So, but these shapes are fairly similar size. The shapes within the head, are all kind of broken up in a similar way. There's not a whole lot of differentiation in there, in kind of distribution of the same fairly limited palette of orange, pink. So there's really not a whole lot. My eye definitely goes to this overall shape, but there's not a whole lot that's locking me in on one aspect of that overall shape. There's so much kind of similarity in the size and shape and organization of those. Very little focal point here. Anyway, I don't know and then I'm back to the beginning. Okay. I'm going to talk more about it in just a second. All right. So let's go back to this. It's not information, maybe interesting than others. Dominant. Maybe that's part of the intention. Maybe that's part of it. So the purpose, is it trying to not maybe a focal point, or attention, an overall experience, or just this is meant to go in a house where the person has a theme in the house of lots of birds and wall paintings and their theme throughout a large, i.e., it isn't meant to attention in that way because it's meant to be up on a wall and to be consumed single background feature in this one part. So the to do with it, these other, the message or what's being communicated isn't necessarily the importance of one flower. That it's the whole vase of flowers that perhaps is what's being communicated or what's significant. So the simplicity of the point obviously has to do with what the intention is or what's trying to be communicated. in this case, are we meant to, is what's being communicated this vase of some kind of plant, or is what's trying to be the person's trying to communicate is how there's kind of an energy that is consistent throughout the plant and how it connects with its surroundings. I don't know. There's something kind of new agey woo woo about this image. So so when does it all kind of point? So what I was thinking about, I'm going to just travel through these images maybe too quickly. What I was thinking about is, I'm thinking about context, thinking about what the intention, what the intended communication is, what this is, the purpose this, what work is this trying to do, I guess is a businessy way to think about it. But sometimes when I'm thinking about these things, it's helpful to look at it from a different perspective. So thinking in terms of uh, the written word, of books, of movies, right? How those things, how different media function, the intended for context, the intended communication and emotional impact, et cetera, et cetera. So I was thinking about books in particular. There are some books that don't follow a story arc of establishing some kind of scenario and then gradually building up to a climax and then fall off resolution. There's this kind of curve, a narrative curve or narrative arc that is fairly common and perhaps most common, right? But then there are books and stories and poems that don't have that arc, that are just more ambient, that are just more kind of stream of consciousness. And you read through, and there doesn't necessarily seem to be one point or one story, one narrative, and it's just more rambling, right? So there are authors that do like kind of stuff, and there are stories that have multiple storylines with multiple climaxes, and I would equate a climax in a story arc to a focal point in a visual image or in a painting. So so different ways, in the written books have different arcs. Some don't have any arc, it's more kind of stream of consciousness. Um, but here's kind of what I come to, and the same with movies, right? There are movies that don't necessarily have one point. I'm thinking of a Linklater. What is that movie? It's about a boy growing up. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, but in that movie, it's like Richard Linklater's life, I think, or a boy, or I can't remember the name of the movie, but I kept on waiting for a climax or like event to happen that turned the trajectory of the story, right? But it never came, and it turned out it was just kind of this meditation on growing. And there were kind of punctuation, as uh, the the movie had its moments that were more intense than others. It never really had this, again, traditional build up to a single boom, single moment, and then de-escalate after that. And it was a good movie. I enjoyed it. I definitely, it required more of me, right? Because I kept on waiting for the message. I kept waiting for the point. When in reality, the point was that there was no point. It was just all the whole movie growing up, and kind of the and downs, right? There's no overarching thing. I guess there were some things and themes and resolutions. Anyway, point being that a lot of different ways to communicate, a lot of different things to communicate, and lots of different levels of specificity communicate about, right? We can take a top view of trying to see an overall story, or we can in on one particular aspect, character, one storyline, right? So there's a lot of kind of levels that we can address in storytelling or in communication. But here's kind of where it comes down to me, with painting and perhaps our moment in history in particular. If you do not have a focal point, you know, with any kind of communication like this video, if I do not have any point to this video, I've asked for your attention, right? You're here, you're giving me your attention. And if I don't tell you why I've asked for your attention or give you a reason to give me your attention, then that's frustrating, right? Because we have a limited resource of time and attention. Now, you might be watching for whatever reason, and you might not need to have any kind of point in watching me or this video or any kind of video. It in itself, the activity might be enough. But I think the majority of us, more often than not, we want for a reason, right? And when we're consuming a communication of any kind, whether that be a song, a movie, a book, if the author of that communication does not clearly identify the point, then it can feel like a waste of time. And it also requires more compute power from us, the viewer, to decipher why it is we chose to spend our time and whether or not that was a good decision to spend our time on this kind of communication. All right. So sometimes this is just for me. Sometimes this is a meandering through my mind. So these were all my thoughts about focal point. And I guess one of the reasons that this came about, there, as a teacher, I need to decide whether or not I'm thing, right? And so often I find myself when I teach, whether it be here or in one of my classes, I find myself really hammering on focal point. Where's the focal point? I didn't mean for that to be a focal point. You meant this to be a focal point. How can we clarify that? And it's, I think, because especially in this moment in our, history as a culture, we don't want to work too hard to divine the meaning of something, and we don't want to waste our time. If you wanted to do something meditative, then you can go off into the forest and sit down or get a lotus position and meditate. But when we're looking at images or content, we want to feel like there's a point, right? This say focal point is important, and unintentional focal points are important. They're bad because they confuse our message. So oftentimes I think an image is successful. The paint application matter is good. The basic composition is good. But often what it is missing takes a little bit of massaging. It doesn't even need to be, nothing needs to be added or subtracted. It just needs to be tweaked a little bit. Often it's that is clarifying focal point. And I think the reason this is so important is because our viewers want to be able to look and understand what is being communicated. It's like if somebody were to tell you something in a very vague way, maybe like this video. Maybe I'm being too circumspect. Maybe I'm being too wordy about what I'm trying to get to. But when somebody's too vague in their communication, it's frustrating. It's like, just get it out. Tell me what you mean, right? Whether it's in a relationship, or whether it's student teacher or whatever the case may be, you want to make sure that you understand what's being communicated. Um, and oftentimes that's where paintings fall down, is just that final little bit of what the focal is. Where do you want me to look? What is important in this image? So today I've already been rambling for quite a while. What I wanted to do, I'm going to attempt something brand new. And this is something that I've wanted to do for a while. So we're going to give it a go today and see if I can make it work. And that is, I'm going to use an iPad to draw on here. So now I'm switching over to the same image I was just looking at, but now I am, whoa, just a second. All right. So now I am on an iPad using the Procreate app, which is one of my favorite art making applications on the iPad. Okay, so let's look at this. Let's look at this where it is. It's a landscape of some kind. It's a fairly large rock, a dome-like rock formation. And there's just a lot of stuff going on here. So what I'm going to do here is kind of first, before I get into anything else, I am going to identify, compositional LC. Let me make this brush a little bit bigger. All right, and maybe get off that layer. We've got this big dome mountain. Right? That's a big shape. I've got this clump of bushes right there, and I've got this clump of bushes right here in the foreground that leads down here, and then in the extreme foreground I've got this little area, this body of water. I've got this shape around, and then I've got kind of an ambient sky. There's some texture in the clouds, but no clear dominant focal point there. So this is kind of my composition, right? The basic shapes of my composition. And naturally, like, the foundation of the composition is interesting. There's nice division of shape. This big dome rock is kind of centered in the composition in a way that, you know, sometimes might be problematic because it's symmetrical. It just kind of locks us on that center axis. But there are ways to use that as a framing device for maybe some asymmetry that could happen within that shape. So that's not necessarily a deal breaker for me. But we have a big shape, we have medium-sized shapes, and we have small shapes. So on that foundational level, this is a good composition. It's interesting, right? Even before we get into what it is, just the way the rectangle of the composition has been divided up is strong. It's good. Good composition. Subject matter is clear. It's rock, right? And that's kind of an interesting subject, right? It's an unusual information. I can get into that. But then after that, I'm lost. I don't know where I'm supposed to go, and I don't like that. I feel like the contrast, like, I go right here, I kind of go right here. It looks like it might be an opening. There's kind of this archway in the rock that kind of points me in that direction. And then there's these kind of dark cracks that happen evenly distributed. There's kind of an, I can see light hitting the tops of these bushes down there and shadows, relationships on some points of the rock, but there's not a really strong sense of volume of that overall rock shape. It's being backlit. It kind of looks like the sun is setting. I can see these distance that look like the sun is going down or coming up, in which case the whole rock shape, we're on the opposite side of the sun, that should be quite a bit darker because it's on the shadow side of that. And I shouldn't have these white areas here in the foreground or white areas down here, if that's the case. So that's, maybe there's some problems with the light logic here. But it's a decent painting, right? landscape. There's some nice overlapping happening here with the foreground, this kind of the shoreline. I'm forgetting what that's called down in the foreground, and the way it overlaps this kind of bush here, which overlaps this right here, which overlaps the rock shape. So there's a nice progression into space, a suggestion of depth in that way. There's some indicators, right? This line, it looks like it might be a fence kind of leading us. The line of the top of these bushes and the way they kind of go up here leads us back here. This line kind of leads us back here, and then you've got this archway. So here's what I'm coming to. I feel like this ought to be the focal point right there. That feels like where give me a second here. I have a little technical problem. Or if my computer turns off, my microphone turns off. I will get that fixed. All right. So I feel like this is where I want to go. The problem is, and I feel like I've got a lot of indicators that are pointing me in that direction. You know, the arch of that framing, the rock formation, and the way the fence is pointing us, and the bushes are overlapping frames this. So this is where I want to go, and it's kind of in the middle of the overall composition, and it's kind of in the middle of this rock shape. Okay, so that is where I feel like I ought to be going. It is not the point of highest contrast. I've got this area up on top, these areas, this area over here, this area over here. I've got all these little points of high value contrast. Tense rock to compete with, right? And then I've got this little white fence that's happening over there. So that's high contrast, and that's to me. So I've got all these little things that are distracting me from that. That's the story. I'm being led there. So I say that it's a great painting. We just need to refine the focal point. Really lock in and clarify that. And the way I'm going to do that first is just by making it higher contrast. And really when it comes to that's what we're talking about. To strengthen a focal point, you need to make it higher contrast. That could be value contrast. That could be hue contrast. Primary colors are the highest hue contrast. That could be saturation contrast. That could be texture contrast. Be for example, with texture, you can have a highly textured area next to a flat area or a relatively less textured area, and that's going to create contrast. So we need to increase the contrast of this area. So I'm going to start with value contrast. So I'm going to take a darker color, and it looks like there's this opening here, and I'm just going to make more of a shadow in that opening. Now, it could be the artist, I can hear the artist on the other end of the line watching this video. Well, that's what it looked like, right? I just painted what I saw, which is a bad answer, right? Like ultimately you're making lots of decisions on how you frame this image. You're making lots of decisions on positioning, on color, on what information you choose to leave out, what information you choose to put in, what information you choose to emphasize and de-emphasize. So that's really not an excuse to say that I'm just painting what I see. You are responsible for what your painting is doing, how it's functioning, what it's communicating. And therefore, you've got to take charge and clarify. If it needs to be clarified, clarify where we are supposed to go and what we're supposed to be looking at. So in this case, I just added, and let me see if I can turn that on and off. I can turn it on and off. Let's see if I can see it there. I just strengthened this opening here, right? I made the shadow darker up here at the top where it would be least likely to get hit by light. And then I just darkened there. You know, again, I'm trying not to alter the structure of the rock too much. I'm trying to just emphasize that area. All right. So already, just with that little change, just increasing the that and making that shadow area less busy, right? It's kind of a more solid shape now. Is going to be contrasting next to all this other texture. Now it's starting to make more sense to me. Now I feel like I look at and I can appreciate all the other texture, all the other stuff that's going on because I know I don't have to worry about, well, what am I supposed to be looking at here? I know what I'm supposed to be looking at. So that's solved for me, right? I don't have to try to compute what is this image about. And I keep on looking around the image, trying to find a place to stop, to end up at. I know where I'm supposed to end up. It's right there at the opening of the map. So I could do that. I could also increase the contrast in this general area. So not necessarily just at the opening, but maybe in these greens, I just add a little bit more of a highlight on. I've got that problem. My microphone is going to go off if I don't keep track of that. All right. So I could also increase the, let's see, increase the contrast on the top of these bushes, making the top of this bush a little bit lighter, right? And that's with this, the black of the hole in the background. I'm going to give some of the lightness on this, whatever it is, to make the bush kind of stand out here more. Maybe poke some bush a little bit to let will air out the bush a little bit and also let some of the dark of that opening come through. I would also probably darken and make the brush a bit bigger. I would darken this fence a little bit. Probably not that much. And probably not that texture. Get a different brush. But just so it's not so black. All right. So again, that just lightening up that area adds a little punch of saturated color. It provides a point of more contrast with the in the background. This kind of frames this area generally, and I could probably do the same thing with this bush on the other side. And these are just, again, doesn't have to be everywhere. Just massaging it, just pop a little bit more. Right. So emphasizing your focal point and de-emphasizing areas that are unintentional focal points. Your eye gravitating that you didn't intend for the eye to go to is the way to think about this. And then, of course, you could, you could always go wild and add more and more detail or refine more and more to your heart's content, right? You could develop the painting even more. The point is that you really, above and beyond any level of detail that you achieve in the rest of the painting, above and beyond whatever interesting stuff that you cram into the image, you need to have a clarity of message, or your viewer is going to be frustrated. They're not going to know how to read the image. And because they don't have something to lock in on, they won't be able to appreciate anything in the image, right? I can't go and start appreciating all this other stuff in the image until I kind of get a lock on what the image is about, right? And I don't know what the image is about. Focal point. All right, so I think I've made the point well enough here, and perhaps I don't need to do any more. I was going to try to do the same thing with this image right here, but I kind of feel like perhaps my point is sufficiently made. All right. So, to wrap the point, most of us, unless you're like a Rothko, unless you're an interior designer, be on the wall in the back or be a punctuation text of a room. If you are in the business, like I am, of making paintings that you want people to look at, not just once, not just in the distance, in the background, in a larger context, you're making paintings that you want people to engage with, to enter in, to move around in. You got to have more than one focal point. You can have primary focal point, secondary focal point. In fact, more than one focal point is good if it's clear that there's a dominant one, right? If it's clear, if your message is clear, right? So if you're in the business, as I am, and as I think a lot of you are, of creating images that do tell a story, where you do want to grab somebody's attention and hold their attention, and then get them engaged in whatever the subject matter of your image is, get them to stay, you got to have a focal point. You got to have a focal point. And you got to get rid of intentional focal points, because you don't want your viewer to be confused, frustrated that they don't understand what's going on, or you just look incompetent, right? Because everybody knows you are trying to say this thing, but really you're saying this other thing. Got to clarify your message. And I think, I guess, and the way to do that, to make a focal point, is to emphasize what your focal point to be, and then de-emphasize other things that are vying for our attention or potentially going to grab our attention. And the way to emphasize is by adding more. To de-emphasize, using contrast, or making more sameness. I think the same thing over and over for about an hour, and perhaps that's enough for today. All right. Well, hopefully this broadcast has stayed live for this entire time, and hopefully it was. Hopefully you could hear what I was saying, and the microphone didn't drop out in